stiletto heel dripping with blood, a body wrapped in bedsheets, and a secret that had been hiding behind hanging clothes for weeks. When Thomas Wilson's mother couldn't reach her son for their daily 1 p.m. call, she had no idea she was about to uncover one of the most disturbing murder scenes Virginia had ever witnessed. Welcome to Silent Crime Witness. Thank you for joining us today. If you're new here, we truly appreciate you taking the time to watch. Please hit that subscribe button to support our channel as we bring these important stories to light. In the quiet suburb of Pinewood Heights, a desperate housewife search for excitement led to a murder so calculated, so cold-blooded, that it still sends shivers down the spines of investigators who worked the case. Thomas Wilson was a 37-year-old small business owner who had spent his entire adult life building his hardware store from the ground up. Friends described him as meticulous, hardworking, and painfully shy. While his high school classmates were going to proms and college parties, Thomas was working double shifts, saving every penny to realize his dream of entrepreneurship. Thomas was the kind of guy who planned everything, said his former business partner, who sold his share of the store to Thomas 5 years before the murder. He had spreadsheets for his spreadsheets. Every decision was calculated, every risk measured. That's what made his choice of wife so shocking to everyone who knew him. By age 30, Thomas had achieved remarkable success. His hardware store, Wilson's Home Supply, had expanded to 3 locations across the county. He owned his home outright, had substantial savings, and was respected in the business community. The only thing missing from his carefully constructed life was a partner to share it with. Late bloomers in the dating world often miss warning signs that would be obvious to others, explained Detective Sarah Mitchell, who would later lead the investigation into Thomas's murder. They're so grateful for attention that they overlook red flags that scream danger to more experienced people. Thomas's mother, Eleanor Wilson, a widow who had raised Thomas alone after his father died when he was just 8, worried constantly about her son's solitary existence. Eleanor was overprotective, but not without reason, said her bridge partner of 20 years. Thomas was all she had, and she knew he was vulnerable in ways that had nothing to do with money. He had no experience with women, no understanding of manipulation or deception. He saw the world as straightforward as a balance sheet, inputs and outputs, honesty and fair exchange. At his mother's urging, Thomas joined several dating websites, including one called Let's Get Hitched, designed specifically for people ready for immediate commitment. His profile was painfully honest. Successful business owner, 35. No dating experience but ready to learn. Looking for a life partner to build a future with. Prefer quiet evenings, financial stability, and mutual respect. Melissa Carter was everything Thomas wasn't. At 33, she had lived what she called a full life, dropping out of community college, cycling through dozens of jobs, and dating men who friends described as exciting but unstable. She had been diagnosed with bipolar disorder in her 20s but was inconsistent with her medication, preferring the highs of her manic phases to the stability of proper treatment. When she began delivering pizzas for Pinewood Pizza, it was her 7th job that year. The owner hired her despite reservations because she was charming and personable with customers. When she was in a good mood, Melissa could turn it on when she wanted to, her former manager recalled. She could make you feel like the most important person in the world 1 minute, then completely forget you existed the next. It was all about what she needed from you in that moment. Thomas became one of her regular customers, ordering pizza twice weekly, always on Tuesday and Thursday, always at 7 p.m. sharp. At first, Melissa barely noticed the shy, awkward man who always tipped exactly 20%. But gradually, as her financial situation became more desperate, she began to pay attention to his fumbling attempts at flirtation and the expensive watch he wore. She started dressing differently on the nights she delivered to Thomas. Her coworker later told police. She'd apply fresh makeup before his deliveries and return to the shop talking about how she might have found her meal ticket. After weeks of this calculated attention, Thomas finally gathered the courage to ask Melissa on a date. She accepted immediately, already envisioning the comfortable life he could provide. Their first date was at an upscale restaurant where Thomas had reserved a private dining room. He was nervous, spilling his water and apologizing profusely. Melissa found his awkwardness useful. It made him easy to manipulate. She touched his hand frequently, laughed at his attempts at humor, and asked detailed questions about his business. "I've never met anyone like you," she told him, a line she had used countless times before, but Thomas had never heard it. By the end of the evening, he was completely smitten. What followed was a whirlwind courtship that left Thomas's friends and family reeling. Within 3 months, Thomas proposed with a 4-carat diamond ring that cost more than Melissa had earned in the past 2 years combined. "I tried to tell him to slow down," Eleanor Wilson later testified. "I begged him to consider a longer engagement to really get to know this woman. But he said he'd waited his whole life for this feeling, and he wasn't going to waste another day." Melissa's childhood friend Daniel expressed even more serious concerns. Melissa had confided in him that Thomas was completely dull and lackluster in the bedroom, hardly the foundation for a lasting marriage. More troublingly, she had explicitly told Daniel that she was marrying Thomas for his money. "She told me, 'I've dated enough broke losers. It's time I cashed in while I still have my looks,'" Daniel recalled. "I thought she was joking at first, but she was dead serious. She even asked me how long she'd need to stay married before she could divorce him and get half." Despite the red flags and concerns from both sides, Thomas and Melissa married in a small ceremony at the county courthouse. Thomas had wanted a large wedding, but Melissa insisted on something quick and private, partly because she didn't have many friends to invite, and partly because she didn't want to wait for the financial security marriage would bring. They moved into Thomas's home in an upscale Pinewood Heights neighborhood, and to everyone's surprise, the marriage seemed to work initially. Melissa joined Thomas at the hardware store, showing an unexpected aptitude for design and helping to create attractive displays that increased sales. For the first year or so, Thomas was happier than I'd ever seen him, Eleanor Wilson said. "He called me every day at 1 p.m., as he always had, but now the calls were full of stories about Melissa. How clever she was, how she'd helped redesign the store layout, how customers loved her. What Thomas didn't know was that Melissa was already growing bored. The stability that had initially attracted her now felt like a prison. Thomas's predictable routines, the same breakfast every morning, the same TV shows every evening, the same lovemaking routine every Saturday night were driving her to desperation. For 10 years, they lived and worked side by side. On the surface, Wilson's home supply thrived, expanding to a 4th location. But behind closed doors, Melissa's resentment festered. She began forgetting her medication more frequently, leading to impulsive shopping sprees that Thomas quietly covered, not wanting to upset his wife. Anyone who's been married for any length of time knows that couples need separate interests and space, explained marriage counselor Dr. Rebecca Hayes, who would later testify as an expert witness at the trial. When two people spend every waking moment together, especially if they have different temperaments, resentment inevitably builds. Add untreated mental illness to that equation, and you have a powder keg waiting for a spark. That spark came in the form of a particularly severe manic episode during which Melissa maxed out 3 credit cards buying designer clothes. When Thomas gently suggested she might need to adjust her medication, she exploded, screaming that she was suffocating in their marriage. The next day, Melissa moved out, getting her own apartment across town. For several months, they lived separately while Thomas desperately tried to convince her to return home. He sent flowers daily, increased her allowance, and even bought her a new car, all attempts to win back the woman he still believed was the love of his life. During this separation, Melissa rediscovered the freedom of her single days, the bars, the attention from men, the spontaneity she had sacrificed for stability. But she also discovered something else. Living on her own was expensive. Her part-time work at the hardware store couldn't sustain the lifestyle she wanted, especially now that she had developed expensive tastes. After weighing her options, Melissa decided to return to Thomas and their comfortable, if unexciting, life together. Thomas welcomed her back with open arms, believing they had weathered their first major marital crisis. He never questioned where she had been or what she had done during their separation, a trust that would prove fatal. For a few months, things seemed better. Melissa made more effort to participate in Thomas's routines, and he tried to be more spontaneous for her sake. Then came the 4th of July, 2011, the day that would set in motion a chain of events ending in blood and betrayal. Thomas and Melissa went downtown to watch the fireworks display. The summer night was warm, the crowd festive, and for a few hours, they seemed like any other happy couple. After the show, Thomas, true to form, wanted to go home and get to bed. He had inventory to do at the store the next morning, and he never started his day later than 6 a.m. Melissa, energized by the festivities, and in the early stages of another manic episode she had hidden from Thomas, wanted to continue celebrating at local bars. Reluctantly, Thomas agreed to let her stay out while he went home to sleep. That decision to separate that night was ultimately what cost Thomas his life, said prosecutor James Reynolds during the trial. Had he insisted they leave together, he might still be alive today. After Thomas left, Melissa made her way to the Rusty Nail, a dive bar on the outskirts of downtown Pinewood Heights, known for cheap drinks and a rough clientele. There, she locked eyes with a stranger across the room, a young, handsome day laborer named Marco Delgado. Marco was 25, muscular from physical labor, with the kind of dangerous good looks that had always attracted Melissa. He was out drinking with a friend, celebrating the holiday and the end of a week of construction work. After several shots of tequila, Melissa's inhibitions vanished completely. She convinced Marco and his friend to join her at the Starlight Motel, a pay-by-the-hour establishment known for not asking questions. "What was Thomas thinking?" questioned Detective Mitchell during a later interview. "He left his wife, who had bipolar disorder and was prone to impulsive decisions, alone downtown to go drinking. It was a recipe for disaster." That night marked the beginning of an intense affair between Melissa and Marco. The relationship was everything her marriage wasn't: passionate, unpredictable, exciting. But there was a problem. Marco was homeless, staying temporarily with various friends and occasionally sleeping in his car. As Melissa's manic episode continued, her thinking became increasingly distorted. She couldn't bear to give up either the financial security Thomas provided or the physical excitement Marco delivered. She came up with a solution that was as reckless as it was unbelievable. "In my 20 years of law enforcement, I've never seen anything like it," said Detective Mitchell. She literally hid her lover in the closet while her husband slept just feet away. Using her knowledge of Thomas's rigid schedule, Melissa created a plan. She converted part of her walk-in closet into a hidden living space for Marco, complete with a sleeping bag, snacks, and even a portable urinal so he wouldn't need to risk using the bathroom while Thomas was home. What Melissa didn't know, or chose to ignore, was that Marco had a criminal record in his home country for aggravated assault. Court records later revealed he had served 3 years in prison for beating a former girlfriend so severely she required facial reconstruction surgery. Melissa invited a violent offender to live secretly in her marital home, said Prosecutor Reynolds. Whether she knew about his violent past or not, she created a situation of extraordinary danger. The arrangement worked like this. Each morning, Thomas would leave for the hardware store at precisely 6:15 a.m. Melissa would tell him she couldn't come to work because of her bipolar disorder, claiming she needed rest. Once Thomas was gone, Marco would emerge from his hiding place, and the two would spend the day together, returning Marco to the closet before Thomas came home at 6:30 p.m. For a month, this dangerous charade continued. Neighbors later reported occasionally seeing a young man entering the Wilson home during the day but assumed he was a repairman or delivery person. The elderly woman next door once mentioned to Thomas that she had seen someone in the yard, but Thomas dismissed it, saying it was probably the landscaper. The level of deception is almost incomprehensible, Dr. Parker noted during the trial. To maintain this double life required not just lying, but a complete compartmentalization of reality that borders on psychopathic. As the weeks passed, Melissa became increasingly reckless. She and Marco began drinking heavily during the day, sometimes not bothering to clean up the empty bottles before Thomas returned. Once, they fell asleep on the couch and barely managed to hide Marco when Thomas came home early with a migraine. The stress of maintaining the deception, combined with her untreated bipolar disorder, caused Melissa to become irritable and careless. She started arguments with Thomas over trivial matters, perhaps unconsciously hoping to drive him away so she could have more time with Marco. Then came the afternoon that shattered everything. August 15, 2011. Thomas had a meeting with a supplier canceled at the last minute. Deciding to surprise Melissa, he picked up lunch from her favorite restaurant and headed home without calling first, something he had never done before. As he approached the bedroom, he heard his wife moaning in ecstasy. Heartbroken and angry, he burst through the door, expecting to find her with another man. Instead, he found Melissa alone, apparently pleasuring herself. Marco had heard Thomas's car in the driveway and had barely managed to dive into the closet seconds before Thomas entered. Embarrassed, Thomas apologized and left the room, narrowly missing the discovery of their secret. That night, as Thomas tried to sleep beside his wife, he heard strange noises coming from her closet. At first, he dismissed it as the house settling or perhaps a raccoon in the attic. But when he heard what sounded distinctly like a man coughing, he became alarmed. Following the sound, he opened the closet door and was shocked to discover Marco hiding among Melissa's clothes, a half-empty bottle of whiskey beside him. "Who is this?" Thomas demanded, pulling Marco from his hiding place. Melissa tried to explain, claiming Marco was just a friend who needed a place to stay temporarily. But Thomas wasn't born yesterday. The sleeping bag, the food wrappers, the portable urinal. It was clear this arrangement had been going on for some time. "How long has he been living here?" Thomas asked, his voice breaking. When Melissa couldn't answer, Thomas told her he was going for a walk to clear his head. He needed to think about what to do next. He told her that Marco better be gone when he returned, and that they would discuss their marriage then. The moment Thomas walked out that door marked the transition from a humiliating discovery to premeditated murder, explained Prosecutor Reynolds. Melissa and Marco didn't panic or flee. They planned. Cell phone records would later show that during the 45 minutes Thomas was walking around the neighborhood, Melissa and Marco exchanged 17 text messages with another man, Marco's friend from the 4th of July night. They were coordinating what police believe was their initial murder plan. When Thomas returned from his walk, he found the house seemingly empty. Calling out for Melissa and receiving no answer, he went to the bedroom to pack a bag. He had decided to stay at his mother's house until he could process what had happened. As he was pulling clothes from his dresser, Marco ambushed him from behind. Using one of Melissa's stiletto heels as a weapon, he bludgeoned Thomas repeatedly while Melissa watched from the doorway. The first blow likely stunned him, the medical examiner testified. But Thomas Wilson was conscious and aware for most of the attack. He had defensive wounds on his hands and arms, indicating he tried to protect himself. He would have been fully aware of what was happening to him and who was doing it. The medical examiner determined that Thomas suffered over 20 blows to his head and body, far more than necessary to cause death. This overkill suggested extreme rage and personal animosity. Overkill is typically seen in crimes where there's a close relationship between victim and killer, explained forensic psychologist Dr. Alan Parker. It's not just about ending a life. It's about obliterating the person. What happened next revealed the true depravity of the killers. Rather than immediately disposing of the body, Melissa and Marco dragged Thomas's lifeless corpse onto the king-sized bed. They then proceeded to have sex repeatedly next to his body, even recording their acts and uploading the videos to cloud storage to share with Marco's friend. "This behavior goes beyond mere psychopathy," said Dr. Parker. "It shows a complete absence of human empathy or remorse. It's the kind of behavior that shocks even experienced investigators." After their macabre celebration, they moved Thomas's body to the bathroom, wrapped it in a blanket, and covered his head with a plastic bag, an apparent attempt to suggest he had been suffocated rather than beaten to death. The next morning, Melissa acted as if nothing had happened. She went to the hardware store and purchased items that immediately raised red flags with investigators later. A shovel, plastic sheeting, duct tape, bleach, and sodium hydroxide. If you see someone buying that combination of items, they're not renovating their bathroom, remarked Detective Mitchell. They're disposing of evidence. It's literally murder cleanup 101. The store clerk later testified that Melissa seemed unusually cheerful that morning, even flirting with him as she checked out. She mentioned she was doing some deep cleaning at home and asked if the sodium hydroxide would dissolve organic material. The clerk, thinking she meant food waste in drains, assured her it would. Melissa's carefully constructed plan began to unravel when Eleanor Wilson called, concerned that she hadn't heard from her son for their daily 1 p.m. conversation. In the 10 years of Thomas's marriage, he had never missed their daily call. Not once. Not even when he had the flu so badly he could barely speak. Melissa claimed Thomas was sick with food poisoning, but Eleanor insisted on bringing soup. "He's my only child," she told Melissa. "I'll be there in 20 minutes. Realizing her time was running out, Melissa panicked. She and Marco had planned to dispose of Thomas's body that night, but now they had no time. In a desperate attempt to save herself, she decided to sacrifice Marco. She drove to her home, ran to her neighbor's door, and hysterically claimed that her jealous lover had just murdered her husband in a fit of rage. "My husband, he's dead. Marco killed him," she screamed, collapsing into her neighbor's arms. "Call 911, please." When police arrived 6 minutes later, they immediately noticed inconsistencies in Melissa's story. Thomas's body was in full rigor mortis, indicating he had been dead for 14 to 18 hours, not just murdered as Melissa claimed. The scene appeared staged, with Thomas's body in the bathtub wrapped in a blanket, his head covered with a plastic bag. "The location of a murder tells us so much," explained Detective Mitchell. "When someone is killed in a bedroom, it typically involves people in an intimate relationship. When the scene is clearly staged, it tells us the killer is trying to create a false narrative." As officers searched the home, they heard noises coming from the master bedroom closet. Opening the door, they found Marco sprawled on a sleeping bag in his underwear, still hiding in the same spot where he'd been living for over a month. "Get your hands up! Don't move!" officers shouted, weapons drawn. Marco surrendered without resistance, appearing intoxicated and confused. Police arrested him for Thomas's murder, but they weren't buying Melissa's story of being an innocent victim. The 16-hour delay in reporting the crime, the staged crime scene, and most damning of all, the videos uploaded to cloud storage showing Melissa and Marco's post-murder activities, all pointed to her full involvement. "If you're going to commit murder, don't take selfies with the body," Detective Mitchell later commented. "Only complete idiots document their own crimes." Melissa was arrested on the spot. Both she and Marco were charged with first-degree murder. The investigation revealed even more disturbing details. Forensic analysis of Melissa's phone showed she had been researching undetectable poisons and how to make a death look like natural causes for weeks before the murder. She had also increased Thomas's life insurance policy from $500,000 to $2 million just 2 months earlier. Marco's friend, who had received the videos, eventually cooperated with police in exchange for immunity from accessory charges. He revealed that Melissa and Marco had been planning to kill Thomas for at least 2 weeks, considering various methods before deciding on the bludgeoning. She told Marco that once Thomas was dead, they could sell the hardware stores and move to Mexico, the friend testified. She said they'd have millions and could live like royalty. At trial, the prosecution painted a picture of a woman trapped in suburban boredom who chose murder over divorce. They argued that Melissa had manipulated both Thomas and Marco, using Thomas for financial security while using Marco to fulfill her need for excitement. "This case represents the dark side of the American dream," said Prosecutor Reynolds in his closing statement. Thomas Wilson built a successful business, married the woman he loved, and created what he thought was a perfect life. But behind his back, that dream was being dismantled by the very person he trusted most. The defense attempted to portray Melissa as a victim of her mental illness, arguing that her bipolar disorder impaired her judgment. They claimed Marco was the primary aggressor who manipulated a vulnerable woman. Melissa Carter Wilson was not in her right mind, her attorney argued. Her untreated bipolar disorder created a perfect storm of impulsivity, poor judgment, and susceptibility to manipulation. She needs treatment, not punishment. For Marco's part, his defense team tried to shift blame to Melissa, portraying him as an uneducated immigrant who had been seduced and controlled by a predatory American woman. She provided the alcohol, the drugs, the plan, Marco's attorney claimed. My client was homeless, desperate, and under the influence of substances she provided. But the evidence, particularly the videos and the elaborate closet living arrangement, convinced the jury otherwise. After just 4 hours of deliberation, both Melissa and Marco were found guilty of first-degree murder. They were sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For the residents of Pinewood Heights, the case was a disturbing reminder that evil can hide in plain sight, or in this case, inside a walk-in closet. Eleanor Wilson, devastated by the loss of her only son, sold his hardware stores and established a foundation in his name to help people with mental illness. If there's any meaning to be found in Thomas's death, she said at the foundation's opening, it's that we must take mental health seriously. Untreated illness doesn't just harm the person suffering. It can destroy entire families. The Wilson case became a landmark in Virginia criminal law, cited in subsequent cases involving hidden accomplices and premeditated domestic homicides. It also sparked a national conversation about the intersection of mental illness and criminal responsibility. The tragedy here is multi-layered, reflected Dr. Parker. A man who spent his life building security was murdered in his own sanctuary. A woman whose mental illness went inadequately treated made increasingly destructive choices. And a community's sense of safety was shattered by the realization that such calculated evil could exist behind their neighbors' doors. Today, the house where Thomas Wilson was murdered stands empty. Despite multiple price reductions, no one wants to live in the home where such a disturbing crime took place. Local teenagers call it the Closet Killer House and dare each other to stand on the porch at night. Eleanor Wilson visits her son's grave every Sunday, bringing fresh flowers and sitting for hours talking to him. She has never returned to the bridge club or any of her former social activities. Friends say she aged 20 years in the months following Thomas's murder. Marco Delgado maintains his innocence from prison, claiming Melissa manipulated him into participating in the murder. He has filed multiple appeals, all of which have been denied. Prison records indicate he has been involved in several violent incidents with other inmates. Melissa Carter Wilson has become something of a prison celebrity, giving interviews to true crime podcasts and maintaining correspondence with several men who have become fascinated with her case. She has been diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder in addition to bipolar disorder and is now on appropriate medication. The most chilling aspect of this case, said Detective Mitchell in a recent interview, is that we'll never know how many other Melissas are out there, people living double lives, harboring dangerous secrets, plotting against those who trust them most. The person sleeping beside you might be a complete stranger. If you or someone you know is struggling with mental health issues, please seek professional help. And if you're entering a new relationship, take the time to truly know the person before making a lifetime commitment. The red flags you ignore today could become the warning signs you wish you had heeded tomorrow. If you found this story impactful, please consider supporting this channel by subscribing. Your subscription truly helps ensure these important stories continue to be told. Like this video if you want others to see it, and share your thoughts in the comments below. I'll be back tomorrow with another case that deserves to be examined in full. Until then, stay vigilant, stay safe, and remember, sometimes the greatest dangers are hiding right inside our own homes.